Good morning.
Good morning.
Today is Sunday, July 5th, and this morning I'm going to delve into the Brahma-Viharas as they relate to Zen practice. The Brahma-Viharas, as they're called, is a Sanskrit term that's often translated in English as the four immeasurables or the four divine abodes. Another translation is the sublime attitudes. And they're immeasurable in the sense that as a form of practice in action, there are no limits. As long as we keep practicing, keep working on ourselves, the potential that practice offers is boundless. No limits. And remember, it's directed at all beings without number. Radiating out in all directions. The Brahma-Viharas are abodes or attitudes in the sense that they are states of dwelling, states of being. Or we can say realms of mind that embody and reflect purity. And here, purity is not in the sense of having mastered some ideal or some standard of perfection, which is really just a concept. But purity in the sense of being unobstructed, free from attachments, free from self-partiality. Free from anger and prejudice. Also free from apathy and disinterest. Free from detachment. It's a mind that is wide open and responsive to whatever presents itself. A good metaphor is a mind that functions like a mirror. A mirror is perfectly clear. It reflects everything without picking and choosing what it reflects. Everything just as it is. Another metaphor would be the shade of a tree. A tree does not pick and choose who it offers its shade to on a hot summer day. Just as a bird does not pick and choose who hears its song. There are four qualities that distinguish the Brahma-Viharas, and they are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And they sound incredibly wonderful. And also perhaps a tall order to actualize in our lifetime. One can even adopt a cynical attitude about them, seeing them as kind of sappy, schmaltzy. Peace, love, and joy for all. Yeah, right. But just like the precepts and the Eightfold Path, they're not intended to represent some unachievable standard. Nor are they commandments, moral commandments. There's no rule book to follow. They're a practice, such that what constitutes, for example, compassion in one situation doesn't necessarily apply to another. Also, consider that sometimes the most compassionate thing to do doesn't look like compassion. It might come off as off-putting or callous. An example of that would be situations where we need to set a clear boundary. There are so many circumstances in our life where firm boundaries are necessary and needed. The most healthy and most compassionate thing one can do, to say no. Situations that have power dynamics, like the teacher-student relationship, the manager-employee relationship, relationships among coworkers. Any situation where there's a potential for it to be abusive or toxic to you or another person. So in this sense, the Brahma-Viharas as a practice, we can see them as fluid, as changing according to circumstances and conditions. And of course, we ourselves are not separate from that fluidity, that flux of life. We're not static. Who we are presents itself moment by moment. And this includes our own needs. And in talking about the Brahma-Viharas, it's actually helpful to distinguish between needs and preferences. They're not the same. There's a difference between one's actual conditions, that is what we're experiencing, and the mind's habit of picking and choosing. Needs have to do with what one genuinely requires, needs in a given moment. Food, rest, safety. We're not trying to deny basic needs. Just as we're not trying to deny our being human. We all need to eat. We all need to satisfy our hunger and nourish our bodies. Which gives us energy to practice. But unlike satisfying a preference, when we satisfy a need, like hunger, once you eat, you're no longer hungry. When you're thirsty, you drink. When you're tired, you sleep. And that's it. There are no further complications to it. But preferences are different in that they're a product of satisfying a want, a desire, an attachment. Such that once you pursue one thing, there's a tendency to go on to pursue another and another, to keep up the momentum. It goes on and on if we let it. Could be as simple as clinging to the idea that I need to sit in a certain seat in the zendo every time, every sitting. I've got to sit in this one seat. This is my seat. There's also the preference of preferring a certain temperature range or humidity level over others. And actually having a preference isn't really the problem itself, it's the clinging to it. Such that you get really irritated if somebody else is sitting in your seat. Or you start ruminating if the weather conditions aren't right the way you want them to be. So it's not that we need to reject or suppress our preferences, which itself is also a form of clinging. What we need to do is notice them. Notice how they're operating. Notice how they cause us unnecessary suffering. So that we can all the more readily let them go. And that means when it's hot, we're just hot. So the starting point is awareness. which we know is enabled by our zazen, and this moment by moment effort we're making to redirect our attention as we go about our everyday lives. So on and off the zazen seat. And without a mind that is stabilized by zazen, it's going to be difficult to see clearly and to practice the Brahma-Viharas. Taken together, we can understand them as a way of dissolving the barriers, the perceived barriers, that is, that separate us. So what I'm going to do is briefly describe each, along with their so-called near enemies, which help to understand how we should practice them. We can understand a near enemy as a mind state that merely masquerades as loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, or equanimity. So it's not the real deal because there's still a trace of self. The ego and its preferences that's getting in the way. We'll start with loving kindness, metta. Etymologically, the root word of metta is mitra, which means friend. So we can generally understand loving kindness as a practice of cultivating warm, friendly, open, and loving feelings towards others and oneself without discrimination. The Dalai Lama famously said, "Kindness is my religion. Kindness is my religion." And this gets at making it a priority in one's life. Not just as a belief, but putting that belief into action. And as many of you know, practice-wise, some people take up the practice of reciting metta verses on a regular basis, such as, "May all beings be at ease. May all be free of suffering. May war cease." You can even direct such verses to specific people in your life, even to yourself. Now, metta practice is not a standard part of Zen practice as it's taught in our lineage that's been passed down to us. But there's no harm in practicing it. Some people find it really helpful. especially in situations where you're stuck in anger or resentment. But, as I always tell people who ask about it, it's not a substitute for Zazen. And the same with the other immeasurables. Zazen is the foundation to practicing the Brahma-Viharas. And as for the near enemy of loving kindness, the primary one is greed. Not just in the overt sense, but also in the sense of friendship or love, masquerading as selflessness. If your motivation or commitment to a relationship is conditional, that is, as long as you get what you want out of it, that's not loving kindness. It's more of a performance of it. All right, moving on to the next, compassion or karuna. Karuna involves recognizing suffering as a universal human experience. And that's actually what it means to awaken, to see into the self. To realize that true self is no self, that nothing's separate. And that includes suffering. My suffering and your suffering are not two, ultimately. So, compassion, what does that look like in practice? Often it reflects an attitude of empathetic listening, empathetic speech and action. So then if somebody tells you about a really tough day that they had, they tell you all about their difficulties, and you reply by saying, well, you think you had a tough day. Let me tell you about mine. That's not showing compassion. A near enemy to compassion is pity. And that is to feel pity, to feel sorry for someone at a distance. Perhaps even telling yourself, well, I'm glad that's not me. There's also a risk of compassion being motivated by ego, as in wanting to be recognized by others as a do-gooder. And here, you just got to notice any sense of pride that shows up whenever you offer a helping hand. Notice wanting to be recognized, to be rewarded. And once you recognize it, you can see through it. Right in that moment, you can drop it. Again, it's a practice. The third Brahma-Vihara is sympathetic joy, or mudita. Put simply, it's the opposite of Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is a German term for taking joy in others' failures or misfortunes. There isn't a close translation in English to it. Perhaps gloating would be one translation. So sympathetic joy is when you feel genuine joy in others' experiences, including their achievements and good fortune, without comparing yourself to them. Sometimes it's called empathetic joy or appreciative joy. And it shows up in that instinctive reaction you have when someone else shares their good news. So, whereas upon hearing someone's bad news, if you were to respond with compassion, you might say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It's got to be difficult." If you hear someone else's good news and you respond with sympathetic joy, it would be, "Oh my God, that's amazing. Congratulations. I'm so happy for you." Saying that wholeheartedly, without reservation. So the obvious near enemy to mudita would be having instead jealous or envious appreciation. Or again, making it performative. Saying something positive only because it's expected or because others are in earshot and you want to make a good impression. That's separation. And lastly, there's equanimity, upekkha. And it's often described as a state of mental, emotional, and psychological stability, as in maintaining poise and composure, not being swayed or jostled around in a reactive kind of way. In Zen, we often use the term noble silence to refer to this inner silence. So it's not literal silence, but the silence of a mind that is aware and settled. And it's not detachment. It's not emotional or spiritual bypassing. It's not dwelling in indifference. It's not social distancing. Those are near enemies, though. I kind of see equanimity not just as one of the four immeasurables, but perhaps even the most important one. And that it enables the other three, just like Zazen. Equanimity arises from Zazen. We need to be aware of what's going on in the mind. The mind needs to be settled and stable enough to notice when self-partiality is kicking in. And that's how we're all conditioned. Each one of us. And that's another reason why practice is endless. We're constantly having to work with our conditioning. Doesn't matter how long you've been practicing. Doesn't matter how deep you've gone. It's endless. Another way to look at equanimity is to emphasize its root word, which is equal. And here's what Alan Wallace, who's a prolific Buddhist author, here's what he says in his book, Genuine Happiness, about equanimity. He says, the inner quality to be cultivated here is more than a feeling. It is a stance, an attitude, a way of attending to others that involves neither attachment to those who are near, nor aversion to anyone who might impede our happiness. This is based simply on the recognition that every sentient being, human and otherwise, is, like ourselves, seeking happiness, wishing to be free of suffering. So yeah, there's this quality of equity that can be infused in how we interact with and tend to others. Whether they're people we consider to be strangers or others, or people we know. Recognizing that everyone wishes to be free of suffering. There's also this wonderful story about a brief conversation between the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi and one of his disciples. It's one that I've shared before. And the story goes that one day the disciple asked him, "How should we treat others?" And an expected response to that kind of question might be, treat others the way you want them to treat you, or always be kind and compassionate to others, and so on. But that's not how Ramana Maharshi replied. Instead, he said to this question, how should we treat others? He simply said, there are no others. There are no others. So how do we treat others as not other, as not to? How do we put that into practice? Again, it starts with awareness. Noticing how quickly we launch into judgments. How often we compare and contrast ourselves with others. How often we get irritated when things aren't the way we want them to be. If we notice it, then we're in a position to let go so that it doesn't muddy or stain, the clarity of that mind that's a mirror. Another important point here is that putting the Brahma-Viharas into practice in our life doesn't mean we need to deny our own basic needs. So going back to needs like safety, dignity, belonging, mental and physical well-being. We don't need to turn ourselves into a human doormat. All beings includes you and me. So the real spirit is just doing the best that we can in the conditions that we're in. Doing our best to cultivate them and radiate them out into the world and within ourselves. We can even understand the Brahma-Viharas from a scientific lens. There are studies on happiness that directly link it to taking interest in and care in others, including people you might not normally associate with. So that involves getting curious about others in a non-judgmental kind of way. Letting down your guard so that you can make a real connection. I remember when, it was some 8 years ago when I moved to Batavia to live at Chapin Mill and become part of the residential staff there. I had some concern that I wasn't going to feel welcome or feel connected socially there beyond the Sangha, that is. I was concerned about the culture change. I grew up in New York City. I've lived in other cities too, Pittsburgh, Rochester. I always lived and worked in places that were diverse, people from all different backgrounds. I had this idea in my head that, in moving to Batavia, everyone was going to be a certain way. Very conservative, very white, and having views different from my own. But what I discovered was just the opposite. Just by making that effort to connect with neighbors, doesn't matter what their political views are, doesn't matter what they think about this or that, can still make a connection on a very human level. My favorite place to do that, by the way, is in a grocery store checkout line. Just to talk with whoever's next to you in line. It's really wonderful. Feeling and sensing connection. It's a practice. But to imagine for a moment how difficult it is for us to practice it, to imagine the conditions we're up against. I want to read another short blurb. And this one is about interacting with a kitten or a puppy. It's from another Buddhist writer, Gil Fronsdale, from the book The Four Faces of Love. And he's talking about the challenge of putting the Brahma-Viharas into action with fellow humans, as opposed to a puppy or a kitten. He says, seeing a small puppy can evoke loving kindness, a feeling of appreciation, goodwill, and friendliness. If the puppy gets hurt, you may feel compassion, a sense of kindness, caring, and a sincere wish for the puppy not to suffer. If the puppy is frolicking around, we may feel appreciative joy, delighting in the happiness the dog feels. And when the puppy is overeager to run after a squirrel, and then deflated when it can't catch it, we feel equanimity. We can clearly love the dog with a stability that keeps us from becoming elated or distressed by its ups and downs. When the Brahma-Viharas become strong, they are much more profound than our responses to a puppy. They enable us to keep love at the forefront in all our encounters with anyone we meet, no matter how challenging. Yeah, so moving from a puppy to another human isn't always easy. But what's the alternative? Living a life closed off, shut down, in opposition. How does that feel? May each one of us find the courage and strength to live and to practice with an open heart. We'll stop here and recite the 4 vows.